would think that after the end of World War II, the Allied powers would continue their combined efforts and rebuild Europe together. Unfortunately, it wasn't that easy.
Once the Nazis were defeated, sharp differences between the Allies came to the surface. Two sides emerged: the United States, Great Britain, and France on one side, the Soviet Union on the other. Like water and oil, they just didn't mix.
The differences really came to light over the question of what to do with Germany. Following the war, the Allies had divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. 3 zones were under the control of the United States, Great Britain, and France. The 4th was under the control of the Soviet Union.
It soon became obvious that the joint government wasn't a practical solution, so the 3 Western powers began talking about reunifying the country. Oh, the Soviets were furious. They were sure that the move was aimed at preventing the spread of communism.
In response, the Soviets blockaded East Germany's border in June 1948, cutting off all land and water traffic. Now this was a problem. Remember, Berlin was inside the Soviet sector. Afraid that the West Berliners would starve, the US and Great Britain launched the famed Berlin airlift to bring in supplies. The Soviets eventually backed down, but the Cold War had begun in earnest.
The crisis over Germany was only one of the clashes and concerns that led the United States and its Western allies to create the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. For decades, this mutual defense pact served as the first line of defense against the spread of communism.
In this next CNN report, you'll see how NATO is attempting to redirect its efforts now that communism has fallen and the Cold War has thawed.
We begin in Europe, where the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was created in 1949. The powerful bloc of nations led by the U.S. was developed to counterbalance Soviet influence in the post-World War II era. But the USSR was eventually disbanded in 1991, and NATO has been trying to refine and redirect its mission ever since. Recently, amid the turmoil of the Balkans, NATO held its Golden Anniversary Summit in Washington. It was the largest ever gathering of international leaders at the White House. Today, Worldview begins a 3-part series examining how NATO got its starts and just where it might be going. Ralph Begleiter has our report.
This is what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created for, standing up to the powerful Soviet Empire. The Soviets had suffered tens of millions of casualties at the hands of the Nazis in World War II and were determined to prevent another humiliation. As the West built its post-war military alliance, so did the Soviets. The Warsaw Pact armies marched to Moscow's drum, presenting a formidable but in some ways a simple challenge to NATO.
Was founded to deal with a single threat by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact.
In 1949, the Soviets sealed off East Germany, a division of Europe that would last 4 decades. Western nations launched an emergency airlift to supply Berliners behind the Iron Curtain. A dozen Western nations signed the NATO Treaty of Mutual Self-Defense.
We have a clear interest, after what we saw in World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, and all the people who died, in a Europe that is united, not divided, democratic, not dictatorial, and secure and at peace, not racked by ethnic cleansing.
Germany had been excluded from NATO at first, but by 1955, the West preempted a resurgence of militarism by weaving Germany into a democratic NATO. The Cold War prompted Europe and the U.S. to look beyond their own borders to a continental defense.
What NATO did was to force countries to commit themselves to a certain level of defense spending. So it actually encouraged NATO countries to keep their spending up.
When the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the fundamental mission of NATO. The alliance has yet to find a replacement mission and figure out how to deal with its former enemy.
The model that the Russians want is a Europe that includes Russia, that takes account of Russia's interests, and that sees it, if not an equal partner, at least an important partner.
NATO experimented with its new European security mission in Bosnia earlier this decade. There, Russian troops joined in the peacekeeping.
There's no reason why the organization can't be both one of collective defense for its neighbors, for its members, and collective security for non-members. And I think this is precisely the strategic mission that NATO is adopting. Russia has nothing to fear.
If Russia doesn't have some role, we're going to see a very stormy Europe.
A stormy Europe is exactly what NATO's leaders hope to avert with a strong stand against ethnic cleansing in the Balkans.
The biggest threat that we have now is the threat of chaos and instability, which comes about as a result of a variety of reasons, but one is ethnic tensions, border disputes, and something that we have said in NATO, the existence of weapons of mass destruction used by terrorists.
Ralph Begleiter, CNN, Washington.
The role of NATO has changed dramatically just within the last few years. After serving as a peacekeeping force in Bosnia, NATO forces took a more aggressive role in Kosovo. Only time will tell what role NATO will carve out for itself in the next millennium.